All right, the game is Hill of Doves from Legion Wargaming. This is the first Anglo-Boer War, 1880-1881. This is just going to be kind of a quick overview. This is a solitaire game. You can see here there's 3 maps. They're mounted. The components are generally pretty good. There's a lot of cards. Interestingly, the way the game does the sequence of play is essentially through these card decks. There's one for the strategic board, one for the operational board, one for the tactical board, and then there's also an events deck, and then this ambush deck, which is how you run through the sequence of play when there's a Boer ambush. There's also this optional battle board, which is really just a way for you to lay out your opposing forces in the areas where you're going to end up using them, reserves, your guys that are doing the British guys that are doing the shooting, then if the British try a cold steel charge, and then Boer patrols, and then the Boer, what is it, Veldkornitskaps? I don't know what that means, but they're like the main forces. So you can it's a way just to organize them. You don't really need to use it, but I found myself using it just because there were times where I had pretty big stacks of stuff, so it was easier to lay the counters all out, so I could read all the numbers on them and tally everything up. The rules for this are problematic. I ended up, I think, figuring it all out and playing everything correctly, but they are there's these 3 books. There's an introductory book, an example of playbook, and the rules book. Things are, essentially the game says, read through the introductory book to explain what all the pieces are, and then read through the example of playbook, and then start playing by just following the cards. Because essentially what you'll do is there's this little step counter that kind of helps you walk through the bullet point on each of the cards. Basically, once you've set the game up as described in the example of playbook, then you start with the start day segment here, and you'll see some of the cards do have a rules citation on them, and I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense. Just read through the example of play, and then once start going through the cards, and as you go through the cards, you can just read the appropriate rules citation on each card to understand everything that you're supposed to do for that card, which is fine. Most of the cards have rules citations on them as you work your way through, and this is what you'll do. You'll go step by step through, and you may not have a particular step that applies, so you just skip the card and keep going to the next step. It's a sequence of play, but it's done instead of on a sheet, with a bullet pointed list. You just flip through these cards, which I kind of liked, especially given that there are essentially 3 different sequences of play, one for each of the boards. And so what these cards do is they will tell you when you need to jump to the other sequence of play. So something that I don't think would have worked very well if you just tried to put it on a bullet-pointed sheet. I mean, you could have, but then you'd just be jumping around the sheet. This is a much more tactile way, and a way that keeps distinct all of the different sequences that you're going to do for each of the different boards. So in that respect, I really liked it. The problem is eventually you will reach cards that don't have a rule citation on them, and then you have to try and figure out where in the rules, under another section of the rules, where the rules for that particular card apply. Usually you can just figure this out through inference. Say there's, I think one of the tactical cards about the bombardment step didn't have the bombardment segment, like there's no citation here. And this is pretty clear. Okay, place bombardment markers showing target and any eligible objectives being assaulted. Well, what are eligible objectives? Where can I find out what would be described as an eligible objective? How would I know if an objective is not eligible? Well, there's nothing on this card that tells me, so I have to figure out, well, maybe it's somewhere in the combat rules. So, you go to the rules book, and you try and find, all right, where's a section that talks about, here, battle. It must be somewhere under here. And sure enough, you can eventually find it under here in the combat section. But there's another one that I ran into, this record assault segment, which says, this is after you've done an assault. If any assaults are carried out this operational phase, place the British assault marker in the same box as the strategic time marker. And so that's this red thing here. So, okay, what does that mean? Like, why am I doing this? Let's see, 2.6. Okay, that's the assaults segment. Record assaults. There's a little historical footnote, and then it says, if during this operational phase the British attempted a night assault that did not disperse, or at least one day assault, place the British assault marker in the same box as their strategic time marker on the strategic time track. Okay, that doesn't tell me why I did that or what the assault marker even means. So I ended up having to go online eventually to find this because I could not figure out where it was. And eventually I did see it in the book, and now I can't, because it actually, explained the whole point of the assault marker. And I found it later on after I'd already found it online, had somebody explain it online. There's a whole section somewhere that talked about it. Here, it's this no British assault at Laing's Neck. So, well, this is under the Boer siege segment. Like, why this no British assault at Laing's Neck are in effect if the British assault marker is neither in the same box on the strategic time track as the strategic time marker, nor in the box immediately to the left of the marker towards the start box. What this means is, the whole point of this thing is that when you do rolls for events, if you do rolls for, what was the other thing? It was either events, I think ambushes, when you're doing rolls for ambushes. If the British have not kept up the pressure on these objectives at the Laing's Neck, which is the entire tactical board, it shows up here as Laing's Neck on the operational board. If the British haven't kept up the pressure here, what that means is that it'll be easier for the Boers to have to conduct ambushes, or more likely that an event, and most of these favor the Boers, it'll be more likely that an event will happen. And I think there may be some of the rules where if the British don't assault Laing's Neck, it modifies the die roll. But that's like huge information. And where do you find that? Not under anything about the assault marker. It's not explained, what the assault marker means in the introductory book, which explains what all the pieces are. No, it's the only place that it's at is here under the Boer siege segment, which you don't even get to until very late in the game. But you need to know what this is for well before then. And like I said, I gave up eventually and just went online to see if I could figure it out. And eventually I did, and then eventually I found it in the book. But that's the problem with these rules, is that things that are relevant to completely different stuff than just whatever citation they're under are just stuck in here. And it makes it very, very difficult to piece together what it is you have to do. The other thing, I was playing under misapprehension at the beginning of the game when this requirement to add +1 to any, here, let's go to the event segment. So you see here on the event segment card, +1 if no British assault at Laing's Neck. Well, I was rolling that every time because I thought that meant this objective here, the neck. Nowhere in the rules, as I was reading through them or on the cards, did it explain what Laing's Neck actually was. I just assumed it meant the neck, but Laing's Neck, and that's what that's technically what this is, but what this encompasses, you can see here's Majuba Mountain, and there's Naquelo. These all appear. There's the Naquelo Plateau. There's the Majuba Mountain on the tactical board. But I did not know that this entire thing meant Laing's Neck. So I was adding +1 like every early turn of the game. Even though I was doing assaults on these different objectives, I was still adding +1 because I thought it meant the neck. And so there's nowhere in the game where it actually says Laing's Neck means the entire tactical board. Or if there is, I certainly didn't read it or didn't see it. And, it was a fight to get through. So, in some ways I can understand why they did the rules this way. And I'm not sure, maybe it's because of the cards because you have the cards as your sequence of play, so they couldn't just do a normal, lay it all out in a certain sequence rule book. But I don't necessarily buy that argument. So I'm not sure why they did this kind of convoluted thing. All it ends up doing is hiding stuff under different areas where you're not actually going to think to look for it. What they should have done is just created a rule book that was essentially a glossary, and so that every term that appears would have a description, so you can go just look it up by the term. So I can just go look up, bombardment segment. What does this mean? What happens in the bombardment segment? And then when they get to the bombardment segments, and it talks about even any of these cards that does have a, like here, no, in Commando Strength, there's no citation there. What does that mean? Tactical column segment 3.3. So you jump there and say you read about your tactical columns. Okay, tactical movement segment, whatever. This has everything you need. What this then also needs is to cite rules elsewhere in the book that also may apply. So, and that was the big thing that they didn't do, is that there were no internal rules citations of other rules, which you really need to do if, going back to this whole assault marker thing, it could have said, okay, assault marker segment means, or the record assaults segment means that what you'll do is put this on the turn track here if you've had an assault that turn. And then, then it cites what that means. And so it would cite in that, where was it, 2.6. So then 2.6 should say, okay, it's fine. It tells you what to do. And then it says, for the effects this has on the game, see rule section, whatever it was, 1.4, no British assault at Lang's Neck. Like, that's what it should have done. Then it would have jumped me right to where it needed to go within the rules themselves. So just, the rules are a barrier to entry for this. But once you got through it, then it actually plays pretty well. I ended up with a British victory. You can see, although here, according to the Parliament versus Triumvirate negotiations track, if it gets to here, the British lose. And you can see I was pretty close to that. There were a lot of events. There were a couple of cities, as these city garrisons surrender to the Boers. They get closer and closer to winning. If Pretoria surrenders, they lose. The British lose completely. Over here, Boer victories. If the Boers start racking up victories, that makes things very, very difficult for the British, because it starts to compound their chances of getting ambushed and of further bad things happening to them. So, as the British, you really don't want to let any Boer victories happen. How do you prevent Boer victories? Essentially, you do it by not assaulting unless you know you're going to win. If it ends up with a British rout, then you've done something very wrong, because what you're doing is stacking up your British forces, and each of the counters have values on them, strength values, and you want to make sure that you're bringing enough force to each of these objective hexes that you plan to assault, to make sure that you get if not 1 times the amount of Boer strength, then 2 times the amount of Boer strength. You're doing a combat differential where you're dividing your British strength by your Boer strength and seeing what number you come up with. If that number is a 1 or any fraction or any 1, between 1, if that number is between 1 and 2, then you are essentially rolling to see if you succeed. And if you fail at that, you can potentially do a cold steel charge and try and avoid taking a loss. If the number is less than 1, then the British are routed. So what you want to do, and there is a variable based on the Boer strength that you're going to fight, and that Boer strength is impacted. Essentially, you draw counters out of a container to see what kind of Boer strength you're actually going to face. There are a lot of different variables that can then impact what that strength is. The first variable will be how many counters you actually draw. Some objectives provide no extra counters for the Boers. Some, like these main objectives here, provide a base of 4 counters that they draw, and then adds one for each company of British assaulting. So essentially, the more British that try and assault these main objectives, the more Boers that are going to be there to defend it. So, you know that for those main objectives, you're going to have to bring a lot of guys. But if you bring a lot of guys, it's actually conversely going to increase the number of Boers that you're going to face. So you don't want to bring so many guys that you make it too hard because there's too many Boers to fight. Then there's other things like one of the Boer generals could be there and he would add more strength points. The British can then reduce those strength points by bringing artillery to other already conquered positions and having them shell the positions that they are trying to take. That can reduce the Boer strength. There's a couple things that can help increase British strength, such as the Gatling gun, which can provide more points. So, there's variability involved, so it can never be a sure thing. Although if you bring a lot of counters to things like these farm objectives or some of the outpost objectives, these are generally going to be easier to take because you're going to have fewer Boer counters, so there's going to be kind of a cap on the amount of points that the Boers are going to be able to bring to bear. So if okay, they're probably, at best, if they have 3 counters, the best they're going to manage would probably be 16 points if they drew all 4s out of the counter. So in order to guarantee a 2 or higher, I just need to make sure I have twice as many points. So I need to bring 32 British points, to try and work the odds in my favor, even accounting for the different variables. That's the kind of thinking that you have to do. So I found it not that difficult as the British to get the points that I needed to take the objectives. And then once you start to destroy the Boer lagers here, then it makes it easier to secure these other objectives without needing to leave garrisons there to protect against ambushes. And the British, they only take hits if they're routed or if they don't make it 2 or better on the combat differential. So there were actually very few times that the British got hit. The other time they could take hits is through things like disease and stuff on the events deck. If they get ambushed, they could end up taking hits there. Because that's when the Boers are hitting a spot, so you're not able to adjust the British counter mix in your favor necessarily. So you could end up taking a potential hit there. But if British counters get reduced and then hit again, then they're sent to the hospital. That never actually happened in this entire game. And it felt like the rules around the game seemed to imply that this should be happening more frequently, like that more British should be getting hospitalized. But it never once happened to me. Like, I was maxed out on my medical supplies. I mean, I had some guys take hits occasionally because I would get a 1. And I had one instance where I had a 0, where I badly miscalculated and got a 0. And so the British got routed and they took 2 hits there. But even that, I had enough counters there where I could disperse those hits. So they're never going to take more than 2 hits, even if they're routed. So I found it interesting that there was all these rules and stuff for dealing with the hospital, for dealing with manhandled artillery. And I was thinking, like, I can't imagine a case where artillery would ever even get hit, because you'd have so many infantry companies that could just absorb hits, and then they can just use medical supplies during the supply phase to heal back up to full strength. So unless I missed something in the rules that said you had to give hits to artillery or something first, I didn't see any instances where artillery would actually be taking any hits. So there's that was an issue around the game, but I again, you can the variables and stuff can go against you, so you can end up getting you can end up taking British losses. But if the Boers start getting a lot of victories, then they start adding 1 for every victory they get. I think, is it during the... I was thinking maybe it was during the negotiations segment, but no. There's a die roll that you do. Maybe it's the ambush die roll or the events die roll, I don't remember now, where every Boer victory counts against you. Like, you start adding modifiers, and so it makes it easier and easier and easier for ambushes and stuff to happen. So the Boer victories can be very bad if you let it get out of control, and it can start to slide this track closer to the British losing the game. So you want to be careful when you're doing your assaults over here. You definitely want to keep the assaults going so you can get the assault counter out there and make sure that you're not having to add that +1 to ambushes and events. If you can keep down the number of ambushes, that can definitely keep the British from being too depleted, because the ambushes will also start sucking up their ammunition. So the ambush roll is tough for the Boers to get if they don't have either victories or, let's just flip to it because there's a number of modifiers for the ambush segment. So yeah, +1 for each Boer victory. So that makes, if the Boers start racking up victories, it starts to make ambushes automatic, and that just becomes, I think, just self-defeating for the British. I think if they keep getting ambushed, there's no way they can win because they're constantly going to be low on ammo. So that's the other big part of the game, is that you're going to spend a lot of time shuttling supply convoys on the operational map, where you'll pull some guys out of the British camp on the tactical map, have them march down here, and then have them march back up to escort the supply train to bring supplies to the British camp. And the supplies are going to be variable every week. You'll do a supply roll to see what level of supplies you get. If you roll low, you're not bringing very much. If you roll high, you're bringing the maximum amounts that you can bring in that convoy. And getting that caravan in weekly is very important. If you don't do that, then your British guys here are going to run out of rations, which is their food. So they're going to start taking hits from that. And maybe that's why the game, had all this stuff about guys being hospitalized and being able to use supplies to heal them back to full strength. I don't know, because that could be a big issue. I shouldn't say I didn't have a problem. I was constantly low on supplies, but always had just enough to get done what I needed to do. The big thing is if you do a lot of attacking and or getting ambushed a lot, you are going to run out of ammo. There's no way you're going to have enough cartridges for all the guys that you need to defend to be able to fire. So that was one reason why I focused on keeping ambushes down. And the way you can keep ambushes down is for the objectives that are unsecured, i.e. you haven't taken other corresponding objectives that mean you don't need to leave a garrison. For the stuff where you do need to leave a garrison, you want to make sure to leave mounted troops there, because that will help reduce your ambush roll to a point where some areas won't even be able to get hit. If you can, keep the assault up weekly, so you don't have to have that +1. Keep the Boer victories down, so you don't have to add that +1. Then you can have a -1 per mounted troop and objective. That'll create a -1. So even if they roll a 6, they're not going to be able to assault anything really, except either a main position or a Majua Mountain if they ambush. So I think keeping ambushes down is probably the most important thing that the British can do if they want to control their own destiny. Sometimes you are going to get ambushed. There's no way around it, because you don't have enough mounted troops to cover every objective. So I tried to focus on the ones that were the higher priorities for the Boers on the priority table, and also the ones that would be harder, or that would be easier to defend, or more valuable, or more difficult to take back if they got captured. So I focused on that. Like I said, I didn't have any hospitalization issues with the British, but the game was still, and there was only one Boer victory, and it could get up to, I don't know, 5 Boer victories. You'd be making a +5 on the ambush roll every time. You'd be getting ambushed every single turn. So I think if you let the Boer victories get out of hand, the game is unwinnable. As it is, the Boers still came very close to independence on the political track. So, I was able to get the Indian column and the naval column both into the British camp. The British start pretty low on forces. They have a crappy general, and Wood eventually arrives, and he's a much better general than Colley, who usually gives you a -1. The sad thing is that Wood, you can see on the back of the card here, a little cemetery, a little burial site. He got killed on the last capturing the last objective of capturing the neck. I ended up rolling a 6 on the general casualty table when the British assaulted the neck. So they took it and were able to win the game, but it did cost Wood his life. So But I did enjoy the game. You know, it's this puzzle of keeping things in balance, really making sure to keep your guys supplied. You know, there were times where I couldn't use my rockets, for instance, because I just didn't have any rockets. You'll go for periods where, like, okay, I guess I can attack with, you know, 6 guys. If I want to run my cartridges right down to the bare minimum, you know, you usually want to leave at least a couple cartridges around in case you get ambushed. But you know, so you're juggling that supply stuff. So I really liked that. I think the game really does work pretty well with this strategic, operational, tactical breakdown, and I think it really works. I liked that you had to roll for the supplies. You know, you just don't know how many supplies you're going to get in that convoy. The weather can be a factor, you know, and moving on this map, you're going to, if it gets to, which it frequently did, if it gets to deep mud, you know, it's raining in deep mud, you know, that takes -2 off the movement. So it's going to take a couple of days for them to get that ox train from Fort Amiel to the Mount Prospect, the British camp hex here, or for troops to get back here to escort to back to Fort Amiel. So, you know, there's all this stuff that you're having to balance, and it was challenging and interesting, you know, especially once I got past all the rules issues. Once I think I figured it all out, then I really started enjoying it a lot more. But it does have that high barrier to entry on the rules, and so if you're frustrated by that sort of thing, I think people have put together some cheat sheets and stuff on Board Game Geek in the files section there. I didn't check them until much later, and at the time I think I just looked in the forums for answers to questions and didn't actually go to the files section. But I think there is stuff out there that would probably help, that I probably would have helped by had I used it. So anyway, I would definitely check this out if you're interested in the Boer War. In this case, it's the first Boer War, or if you're just interested in this era of, you know, the British colonial Victorian era, you know, late 19th century, various British engagements that they fought in. You know, I'm a big Zulu War buff, and just in general am interested in this particular period. So this title definitely appealed to me in that regard. So if you're into that, I would check it out. If you're into solitaire games, also likewise check it out. You know, if solitaire games aren't your jam, or you don't really like this particular, or not really interested in this particular period, probably give this a pass, just because you're gonna have to suffer through working your way through those rules issues. So anyway, Hill of Doves.